France is known as a country that values human rights. But what if France has been exploiting economically disadvantaged African countries? What I am going to share with you today may be hard to believe. However, France has been criticized for its economic exploitation of African countries through the currency known as the CFA Franc. What exactly is the CFA Franc that France controls? In this two-part series, Part 1 and Part 2, we will explore the great darkness in France. Hello everyone, my name is Kanta. Have you ever heard of the term CFA Franc? First of all, let me explain what exactly a CFA Franc is. The CFA Franc is the common currency used in the countries of West and Central Africa. Most of these countries were once French colonies. A common currency is a currency that can be used commonly within an area. The euro is an example of a common currency. Going back in history, most of Africa was under colonial rule by European countries from the 19th to the mid-20th century. This map shows how African colonies were divided among European countries in 1913. The continent of Africa is about 80 times the size of Japan, and this vast continent was divided and controlled by only 7 European countries. Of these, the two most influential were Great Britain and France. The blue areas on this map were French colonies. Let's get back to the main topic. The CFA franc is the common currency used in the countries of West and Central Africa that were once French colonies. Just as the euro is used in the member states of the European Union, the CFA franc is a currency that is accepted across borders within the region where it circulates. There are actually two types of CFA francs: the CFA franc issued by the Central Bank of West African States and the CFA franc issued by the Bank of Central African States. Each circulates in separate countries, and one CFA franc cannot be used in the region where the other circulates. This map shows the countries where CFA francs are used. In the countries in green, CFA francs issued by the Central Bank of West African States circulate, and in the countries in red, CFA francs issued by the Bank of Central African States circulate. The CFA franc has the following characteristics. It has a fixed rate of exchange with the currency of the former sovereign, i.e. France, which once colonized the entire region. The CFA franc regime was introduced in 1945 between France and the countries that were under French colonial rule, but the exchange rate changed only twice, in 1948 and 1994. In 1994, the exchange rate was devalued to 1 French franc equals 100 CFA francs. And on January 1st, 1999, the exchange rate was set at €1 approximately 656 CFA francs, following France's introduction of the common EU currency, the euro. We will look at 3 problems with the CFA franc. The first problem with the CFA franc is that the exchange rate with the euro is set at a high level. What does it mean that it is set at a high level? This means that the value of the CFA franc currency is set higher than it should be. The CFA franc is used in countries in West and Central Africa that were once colonized by France. These countries include Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, for example, which are considered among the poorest countries in the world and have very weak national economies. The currencies of poorer countries have lower international values because of their economic power. This is because the economic strength of the country itself is low. Nevertheless, the exchange rate of €1 equals 656 CFA francs, which is a high currency value compared to the economic power of the countries where CFA francs are used. So what are the disadvantages for poor countries if the value of their currency is set higher than it should be? Generally, the international value of a currency is proportional to its economic strength, with currencies of economically strong countries trading at higher prices and currencies of economically weak countries trading at lower prices. In today's world, for example, the US dollar is very powerful, and when the US economy is doing well, the dollar becomes even more valuable. Conversely, when the US economy is not doing well, the dollar becomes less valuable. The currencies of economically poorer countries, such as those in Africa, are usually worth less. However, there is an advantage to having a low currency value. It means that they are export friendly. This is because agricultural products, industrial goods, and natural resources produced in countries with low currency values have relatively low international prices, making them favorable for export. You may have learned in school that when the value of your currency is high, the price of your exported goods in a foreign country will be high, thus reducing your international competitiveness. Conversely, when the value of your currency is low, it is advantageous to export. However, as I discussed earlier, the CFA franc used in Africa has a fixed exchange rate with the euro, the currency of economically powerful countries. Moreover, this exchange rate has been fixed at a high level of value for the CFA franc. This makes it unfavorable for African countries using the CFA franc to export, and makes it difficult for their own industries to develop. The economic structure of the CFA franc has been an obstacle to the economic development of the African countries in which it is used. Herein lies one structural factor that prevents Africa from developing indefinitely. Conversely, this is a favorable situation for France to export to African countries. In fact, even after the independence of its former colonies, France took advantage of the low value of its own currency to export a large amount of goods to its former colonies, thereby reaping economic benefits. From the African country's point of view, this means that all kinds of French goods come in at low prices. France is by far the largest producer of goods than the African countries. Therefore, products made in Africa cannot compete with France on price. The continued dependence on imports from France makes it difficult for the economies of African countries that adopt the CFA franc to become self-sustaining. France has always been ranked among the top trading partners with African countries, and in fact, this has been due in part to the CFA franc system that France has built up since its colonial rule. The second problem with the CFA franc is that member countries are not free to issue their own currency. This means, in other words, that they lose the right to issue currency. The status of a country as independent involves the right of its government or central bank to issue its own currency. However, this right to issue currency has remained lost to African countries long after they gained independence from French colonies. As mentioned earlier, CFA francs are issued by a central bank, but the policy decisions of this central bank are only made if they are unanimously agreed upon by a board of directors composed of representatives of several countries. Nevertheless, the board of directors of this board has always included elected officials from France. This means, in effect, that France has controlled the authority to issue the currencies of member countries. What problems arise when a country cannot issue currency at its own discretion? For example, when a country's economy is in bad shape, policies may be implemented to bring the economy back on track by printing more bills and increasing public works projects, such as building roads and bridges. However, countries that are members of the CFA franc are not allowed to freely print money and therefore cannot implement such policies. This means that it makes it difficult for the government of a country to control its own economic situation. African countries that are members of the CFA franc are economically poor and should be able to improve their economies by increasing public works projects such as roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. But because France effectively holds the right to issue currency, it is difficult for them to make such policy decisions. This is one of the reasons why African countries are also struggling to improve their economies. The third and biggest problem with the CFA franc is that member countries must deposit 50% of their foreign currency holdings in the French treasury. There is a provision that states that countries using CFA francs must deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury. What are foreign exchange reserves? Let me explain briefly. Foreign exchange reserves are the foreign currency held by a country's central bank, central government, or other institutions related to finance. These reserve assets are used, for example, in the event of a currency crisis, when a country finds it difficult to repay its debts to other countries. If a country keeps these foreign exchange reserves well, for example, in the event of a currency crisis, it can take economic action using the foreign currency assets it has prepared, i.e., its foreign exchange reserves. However, countries that are members of the CFA franc must pay half of their foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. In other words, this means that half of the assets that should have been used for economic development in Africa have been taken away by France. Why do CFA franc members have to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in the French treasury? The reason, as mentioned in the first issue, is to maintain the exchange rate between the French side's currency and the CFA franc. Nevertheless, the fact that half of the foreign currency reserves must also be paid into the French treasury is a rather severe restriction for economically weak African countries. From a different perspective, the more African countries that are members of the CFA franc export abroad, the more foreign currency they earn automatically goes into the French treasury, and this has been an important source of income for France. This is the point where the CFA franc has been strongly criticized, saying, "This is no different from colonial rule." While we have looked at the problems with the CFA franc, it also has its advantages. What advantages does the CFA franc have? The advantage of the CFA franc is that the stability of the currency is guaranteed by France, an economic powerhouse. For economically developing countries, ensuring the stability of their currency is an important issue. Africa has a diverse ethnic population, and after gaining independence from colonial rule, many countries experience political and economic instability, including coup d'etat and civil wars. In countries with political and economic instability, the stability of the country's currency can also be compromised. For example, in Zimbabwe, a country in southern Africa, the Zimbabwean dollar was introduced in 1980 after gaining independence from the United Kingdom. But political failures led to severe inflation around 2000. The hyperinflation that occurred in Zimbabwe caused prices to rise by 2.2 million% per year in 2008. If the stability of a currency is undermined, a country's economy will suffer. On the other hand, countries that have adopted the CFA franc have the economic powerhouse of France to guarantee the stability of their currency, which leads to economic stability. For example, in countries where hyperinflation occurs, the value of the currency can become as good as scrap paper overnight. However, even in the event of economic collapse, the fixed exchange rate for the euro means that the currency can be redeemed without losing value. European colonial rule of African countries continued for nearly 100 years, but Europeans at that time did not consider the self-reliance of Africans after independence. As a result, many countries came to independence with insufficient modern institutions and knowledge, and Africans were not equipped with the ability to run a nation on their own. If colonial rule were to end one day once and for all, the state would not be able to operate. That is why the argument was made that the CFA Franc, which would ensure the stability of the currency, had advantages. On the other hand, we have seen that the continuation of the CFA Franc would be of great benefit to France. Some critics of the CFA Franc make this argument. The presidents of West African countries want to abolish the CFA, but if they say so, they will be assassinated by France. Politicians have no choice but to do what France says. West Africa is in a state of economic slavery. West Africa, including Benin, has not yet achieved independence. The CFA Franc has caused a lot of controversy, with some critics saying that it is no different from colonial rule, and others defending it by saying that it ensures the stability of the currency. Now that you have seen both the advantages and disadvantages of the CFA francs, what do you think? Please share your opinions in the comments. It is difficult to make a clear, good or bad decision about CFA Franc, because it has both advantages and disadvantages. As I always say, most things in this world are not as simple as black and white, or 0 or 100. However, if you look at the historical background of why the CFA Franc was created, and even consider the recent moves to abolish the CFA Franc, you may change your view of the CFA Franc. We will continue to look at the reality of the CFA Franc in the Part 2 video. In fact, it is pointed out that the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa in recent years is also related to the move to abolish the CFA Franc. The following video should help you change the view of the world that you have been holding. Part 2 of this video will be up soon, so please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching to the end. See you again in the next video.